Mary Richards, the daughter of billionaire Richard Richards, had always been the center of attention. Spoiled, manipulative, and used to getting her way, she had a penchant for drama. One fateful evening, her life took a dark turn, and she dragged an innocent man into her web of lies. Mary walked down the grand hallway of her father's mansion, her heart light, humming a tune. She had a message from her father to deliver to James, their loyal family driver. As she reached his room, she didn't bother to knock. She turned the doorknob and stepped inside. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. James was coming out of the bathroom, completely naked. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She froze, her eyes wide with shock. James, equally stunned, stood still, his face pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. I didn't know you were here," James stammered, his voice shaking. He quickly rushed back into the bathroom and grabbed a towel. Moments later, he emerged, the towel wrapped around his waist. But Mary was still standing there, staring at him, her gaze heavy and piercing. "Mary, please leave. This isn't right," James said, his voice trembling. But Mary didn't move. Instead, she slowly closed the door behind her, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing in the small room. She began walking toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. "What are you doing, Mary?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary's lips curled into a small smile. "I want you," she said softly, her voice calm but chilling. James's heart pounded in his chest. He shook his head quickly. No, Mary. Don't say that. This is wrong. I'm engaged, and you're too young for this. You're just 16. But Mary didn't stop. She kept moving closer, her voice low and firm. "If you don't do what I want, I'll tell my dad you forced me." James's face went pale. You can't do that," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Mary didn't reply. She was now standing right in front of him, her eyes locked onto his, daring him to stop her. James panicked. He gently pushed her away, his hands trembling. "No, Mary. Stop this. Please. This isn't right." Mary stumbled back, but caught herself, her face twisted with anger. She grabbed her dress and pulled at it, tearing it apart. "Help! Help!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "He's hurting me!" James's heart stopped. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Stop this, Mary!" But Mary didn't stop. She screamed even louder, her voice echoing through the walls. James rushed toward her, tried to stop her from yelling. "Please, Mary, stop shouting," he begged, his hands trembling as he tried to cover her mouth. But Mary kept struggling, pushing him away and screaming louder. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud bang. There stood Mr. Richard, Mary's father, his eyes wild with anger as he took in the scene before him. James was standing in a towel, his hands on Mary, who looked disheveled and frightened. Her dress was torn, and tears were streaming down her face. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air had frozen. "What is going on here?" Mr. Richard roared, his voice shaking the walls. James stepped back, his hands in the air. "Sir, please. It's not what it looks like. I swear I didn't do anything." Mary ran to her father, crying loudly. She clung to his arm, her body trembling. "Daddy, he tried to force himself on me," she sobbed. "I told him no, but he wouldn't listen." Mr. Richard's face turned red with rage. He turned to James, his fists clenched. "How dare you?" he bellowed. James shook his head frantically. "No, sir. She's lying. I didn't do anything. She came in here and—" "Enough!" Mr. Richard shouted, his voice like thunder. "James, how could you do this to my daughter?" James fell to his knees, desperate to explain himself. "Sir, please. I'm innocent. I didn't do what she said." But Mr. Richard wouldn't listen. His heart was too heavy with betrayal. Mary, on the other hand, was sobbing uncontrollably, standing there looking like she had just endured something horrible. But her tears seemed fake to James. Without wasting a second, Mr. Richard grabbed his phone and dialed the police. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as officers rushed to the house. "Arrest him!" Mr. Richard shouted, pointing at James. "He forced himself on my daughter." James was still on his knees, crying and pleading. "Please, I didn't do anything. You have to believe me." But the officers didn't listen. They handcuffed him tightly and dragged him to their van. James kept crying, shouting that he was innocent, but no one paid attention to him. The news spread quickly, faster than James could keep up with. Headlines flashed across the screens. Billionaire's driver accused of assaulting daughter. Soon, the police station was filled with reporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved in Mr. Richards' face. When James's fiancée, Lucy, arrived at the police station with her best friend, Ella, her face was red with anger. The moment she saw James, she shouted at him. "So it's true, isn't it? What I heard is true. You've decided to disgrace me." James, Ella, her friend, tried to calm her down. "Lucy, wait. Let's hear what James has to say first before you jump to conclusions." But Lucy wasn't listening. She was too upset. "I'm innocent, honey," James cried, trying to explain himself. "Don't ever call me honey again," Lucy yelled, cutting him off. She turned her back to him and stormed out of the police station in anger. James stood there, helpless, his heart breaking into pieces. Later, when Mr. Richard arrived at the police station, James immediately rushed to him. "Sir, please listen to me," James pleaded, his voice trembling. Mr. Richard hesitated. He was so confused, unsure of who to believe. But after a long pause, he walked toward James, deciding to at least hear him out. "Sir," James began, his voice desperate, "please believe me. Your daughter, she's been trying to get me to sleep with her. I refused, but she wouldn't stop. This isn't the first time, or the second time, or the third. 2 days ago, she trapped me in the hallway and tried to kiss me. I ran away for my life. Today, she threatened to accuse me if I didn't sleep with her. Please, sir, I swear I'm innocent. Please believe me." Mr. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his mind spinning. The words didn't seem to make sense. "You're a liar, James," Mr. Richard yelled, his voice breaking with pain. "I trusted you. I treated you like family. And this is what you do to me." Tears filled James's eyes as he sank to his knees, sobbing. "Please, please. I didn't do it," he cried. But Mr. Richard walked away, unable to listen anymore. As Mr. Richard stepped out of the police station, reporters surrounded him, asking questions. "Sir, what do you think of the situation?" one reporter asked, shoving a microphone in his face. Mr. Richard didn't answer. He was too lost in his thoughts, his mind racing. Could it be that his daughter was lying? When he arrived home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He immediately rushed to his office and began going through the footage from the secret cameras he had installed around the house. The first video he watched made his stomach turn. There, in the hallway, was Mary, trying to touch James in a way that made him clearly uncomfortable. James pushed her away and quickly walked off. Mr. Richard froze. Could it really be true? Was his daughter lying? Then he watched another video. This time, it was in the living room. Mary was sitting next to James, whispering in his ear. She tried to touch him again, but James moved away, clearly stopping her. His heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. His daughter had been lying. Shaking, Mr. Richard called Mary. "Mary," he said, his voice shaking, "tell me the truth. Is what you said earlier true?" Mary, her voice trembling with fake tears, answered, "Yes, Daddy. He forced himself on me." Mr. Richard couldn't hold back his anger. "Have you ever tried to seduce him before?" Mary gasped. "Me? How could I, Daddy? I would never do that." But Mr. Richard wasn't fooled. He showed her the videos from the cameras, the ones where she tried to touch James in ways that weren't appropriate. "Shut up and answer my question," Mr. Richard shouted, his anger rising. Mary stood frozen, unable to speak. Her face went pale as she realized that her father knew the truth. After a long silence, her voice shook as she said, "James didn't force himself on me. I was angry because he rejected me. I thought if I made him look bad, maybe you'd finally see me." Mr. Richard's eyes widened. "What? You made all this up?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "How could you lie like this?" Mary's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of frustration. "It's your fault, Daddy," she cried. "You never let me talk to anyone, to have a boyfriend, to even have a friend who's a guy. James was the only one who was there for me. You locked me up here like a prisoner while you go around enjoying your life. You didn't care about me." Mr. Richards stood there speechless. His heart felt like it was being ripped apart. "You're evil," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe you would do this. You've destroyed everything. You've ruined our family, our name. How could you do this to me?" Mary stormed out of the room, leaving her father standing there, crushed. The weight of what had just happened was too much to bear. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind racing. "What do I do now?" he asked himself. "How can I go out and tell the world that James is innocent? My reputation, my daughter's image, everything will be ruined." His thoughts kept spiraling. "No, I can't say he's innocent. The world already believes the worst about him," Richard muttered to himself, a cold sweat on his forehead. The next morning, Richard called Mary into the sitting room. His voice was cold, filled with authority. "Mary, you cannot tell anyone that James didn't do anything wrong. Do you understand? You caused all of this. The world already knows about this case, and we can't back down now. We can't risk ruining everything more," he warned. Mary stood there, stunned. "Dad, are we really going to let him go to prison for something he didn't do?" she asked quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. Richard's eyes narrowed, and his face grew hard. "Yes, Mary. This is the path we have to take now. It's too late to turn back." Days turned into weeks, and finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. James was brought to the court with his family, sitting in the front row, their faces full of worry. Richard and his associates were seated with him, and so were James's fiancée, Lucy, and her best friend, Ella. The courtroom was tense with anticipation. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell completely silent. Everyone held their breath as the judge flipped through his notes, preparing to speak. "Mr. James Wilson," the judge called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Please rise." The room seemed to close in around James as he stood, his legs shaking. He tried to stay strong, but inside, he felt like he was being crushed. After reviewing the evidence and considering all the arguments, the judge continued, his voice heavy. "This court finds you guilty of sexual molestation. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison." James collapsed to the ground, his sobs loud and heart-wrenching. "I'm innocent. Please, I didn't do it," he cried, his voice broken. His mother burst into tears, crying out for her son. But no one listened. Lucy, with tears in her eyes, walked up to James. She took off his wedding ring, holding it for a moment before tossing it onto the ground in front of him. "I'm done with you, James. Goodbye," she said, her voice trembling. Without another word, she turned and left, walking out of the courtroom as if her heart had turned to stone. James's heart shattered as he stared at the ring, unable to move. He didn't know what hurt more, the prison sentence or the loss of Lucy. Ella, who had been standing silently by Lucy, stepped forward. She tried to talk to her, to reason with her, but Lucy wouldn't listen. "I can't do this anymore, Ella. I can't be with him. Not after everything," Lucy said, her eyes cold. Ella, feeling helpless, tried once more. "Please just think about it. What if he's innocent?" But Lucy shook her head. "I don't care anymore, Ella. It's over." As the police dragged James out of the courtroom, the finality of it all hit him. His whole world was falling apart. Mary sat silently, watching, her eyes vacant, her heart distant. "Please, Mary," James whispered, his voice shaking as the officers pulled him away. "Tell them I'm innocent. Please, don't let me go to prison for something I didn't do." But Mary didn't say a word. Her eyes never met his. As the police shoved him into the van, the doors slamming shut behind him, James felt a sense of hopelessness wash over him. He was alone, abandoned by everyone he had ever cared about. Days turned into weeks, and the world quickly forgot about James, moving on to the next scandal. But Lucy, she never once wanted to visit James in prison. Ella, however, was different. She would visit him as often as she could, always trying to assure him that things would get better. One day, during one of her visits, James broke down in front of Ella, his voice thick with emotion, his tears flowing freely. "I'm innocent, Ella," he sobbed. "I don't know how to make the world believe me anymore. Everyone's turned their back on me, my friends, my fiancé, even my dad. They've all abandoned me. Ella's heart ached as she watched him fall apart. She had always believed in him, but seeing him like this, broken and alone, was almost too much to bear. "I'm the only one left," James whispered, his voice filled with so much pain. "It's only you and my mom who still care. Thank you, Ella. Thank you for believing in me." Ella felt a fire ignite inside her. She couldn't let James suffer like this. She swore to herself that she would do whatever it took to get him justice. She would fight for him, even if it meant going against everyone else. "I'll do whatever I can, James," Ella said, her voice strong, full of determination. "I promise you, I'll make sure the truth comes out. I won't let them do this to you." James nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. He knew that with Ella by his side, maybe, just maybe, he would get the justice he deserved. 3 years later, Ella sat on her bed, aimlessly scrolling through job postings on the internet, when something unusual caught her eye: a cleaner vacancy at Mr. Richards' mansion. Her heart skipped a beat. Could this be my chance? She thought. For 3 years, she had never stopped thinking about James, locked away for a crime he didn't commit. She had promised to help him, but time kept slipping through her fingers. Now, fate had placed an opportunity right in front of her. Ella didn't know exactly how she would get justice for James, but one thing was clear. This was a door she had to walk through. Without hesitation, she applied for the job. A few days later, her phone rang. It was from Mr. Richards' mansion. "Miss Ella, you have been selected for the cleaning position. Can you start next week?" Ella could barely contain her excitement. "Yes, I'll be there," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. That same evening, she rushed to the prison to share the news with James. When he saw her walk into the visiting area, James smiled weakly. He looked thinner, his once bright eyes now filled with sorrow. "I have something to tell you," Ella whispered, leaning closer. "I got a job at Mr. Richards' house." James's eyes widened in shock. "What? How?" "I saw the job posting and applied. They hired me." James ran his hand over his face, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ella, do you know what you're getting yourself into? That place is dangerous. If they find out why you're there—" "I know," she cut in, determination burning in her eyes. "That's why I need your help. Do you have any idea how I can prove your innocence?" James hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Yes, but it won't be easy. Mr. Richard has secret cameras in his house. If you can find them and get the footage of Mary forcing herself on me, it will be the proof I need." Ella's heart pounded. This was risky. If she got caught, she could end up in serious trouble. But if she succeeded, James could finally be free. She looked into his tired eyes and gave him a firm nod. "I'll do it." James let out a shaky breath and grabbed her hands. "Thank you, Ella. You don't know how much this means to me." Ella squeezed his hands back. "I won't stop until the truth comes out." As she left the prison that evening, a mix of fear and determination swirled inside her. The fight for justice had just begun. Ella had just started her job as a cleaner in Mr. Richards' mansion. The house was massive, with tall gates and shiny floors that reflected her every step. Ella wasn't there just to clean. She had a mission to expose Mary, Mr. Richards' spoiled and rude daughter. Her plan was to get close to Mary, to befriend her, and gather the truth. But it wasn't long before Ella realized that Mary wasn't someone who could be won over. Mary was rude, arrogant, and mean, a true spoiled brat. Ella sighed but told herself, "I won't give up. I'll find another way." One day, while cleaning, Ella spotted Mr. Richard in his bedroom. The door was slightly open, and she froze in her tracks. He was watching something on his computer, secret camera footage. Her heart raced as she realized this could be the key to proving Mary's wrongdoings. But there was one problem. The computer was in Mr. Richards' bedroom, a place she could never access without being caught. Months passed, and Ella waited for the perfect opportunity. Then came Mary's birthday. That night, the house was filled with music, laughter, and clinking glasses. Everyone was celebrating, drinking, and dancing. Ella, however, refused to drink. She wanted to stay sharp. As the party wound down and the guests left, Mary and her dad sat drunkenly in the living room, laughing and slurring their words. Ella knew this was her chance. Quietly, she sneaked upstairs to Mr. Richards' room. With trembling hands, she opened the door and slipped inside. The computer sat on the desk, glowing faintly in the dark. She started searching the files, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. She searched through folders and videos, her heart pounding louder with each second. But the video she was looking for, the one about James, wasn't there. Frustrated, Ella almost gave up until she checked the recycle bin. There, she found it, a video showing Mary trying to force herself on James, who desperately tried to push her away. Ella froze, her body shaking. So it's true, she thought. She pulled out her phone to record the evidence. Suddenly, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Richard. He looked tipsy, his eyes half closed as he stumbled toward the bed. Ella's heart felt like it would burst out of her chest. She quickly slid under the desk, holding her breath. Mr. Richard sat on the bed for a moment before collapsing onto it. Ella stayed hidden, waiting until his soft snores filled the room. Slowly, she crawled out, grabbed a spare key she noticed on the dresser, and slipped out of the room. Back in her room, she sat on her bed, clutching her phone. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. I was so close to being caught, she thought, her heart racing. The next morning, Mr. Richard left for work. Ella knew this was her best chance. With the stolen spare key, she sneaked into his room again. She quickly opened the computer and recorded the evidence. As she was about to leave, her elbow knocked over a glass on the table. It fell to the floor and shattered, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Ella froze. Downstairs, Mary, who was eating breakfast, heard the noise. She ran upstairs, yelling, "Who's there?" Ella quickly hid under the desk again, her heart thundering. Mary barged into the room, her eyes scanning the place. She spotted the broken glass on the floor and grew nervous. "Who's here? Show yourself," she shouted. Mary called the security guards on her phone, her voice shaking. "Come to my dad's room now. Someone's here." Ella knew she had to act fast. She stepped out from under the desk, facing Mary. "You!" Mary shouted. "What are you doing in my dad's room, you poor maid?" Ella glared at her. "Shut up, Mary. 3 years ago, you lied about James. You accused him of something horrible, and it ruined his life." Mary smirked. "And how is that your business?" "It's my business because I have the proof now," Ella said, holding up her phone. "See you and your dad in prison." Mary froze, her face pale. "You have the video?" Just then, the security guards rushed into the room. Mary shouted, "Catch her! Tie her up!" Ella quickly raised her phone. "Don't you dare touch me, or I'll upload this video right now. One wrong move, and the whole world will see what you've done." The guards hesitated, looking at Mary for instructions. Mary growled, "Stop. Don't touch her." "What do you want?" Mary asked desperately. "Money? How much?" "Just delete the video." "I want $2 million, Ella said firmly. "What? That's ridiculous." Mary shouted. "Take it or leave it," Ella replied. Mary sighed. "Fine. Let me call my dad." Ella nodded. "Tell your guards to let me go first." Reluctantly, Mary told the guards to step back. Ella slowly walked toward the door. Ella clutched her phone tightly as she made her way to the final exit. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had the evidence, the video that could expose Mary and Mr. Richard. Victory was within reach, and all she needed to do was leave the mansion safely. But as Ella approached the exit, she didn't notice a shadow lurking nearby. Suddenly, a security guard jumped out from the corner. Before she could react, he hit the phone out of her hand. It flew across the room and crashed onto the floor. Ella gasped, her hand reaching out, but it was too late. The guard grabbed her roughly, twisting her arms behind her back. "Got you," he sneered. "Let me go." Ella screamed, struggling to break free.